Hello, sixth graders. This will probably be our final video for the school year. Before we get started, really quickly make sure that you finish the assignments for this week. On Friday, I will be posting your last assignment for me. You won't need your book for it. It's one of those reading-based packets, and it won't be due next Friday. Instead, it's going to be due probably Tuesday or Wednesday of next week because I have to have time to get all the grades in. So make sure that you get that done a little bit quicker than normal. I think the grade cutoff for Miss Gooder in science said is like Tuesday, so probably Tuesday or Wednesday for me will be my cutoff as well. Just gives me time to get it all graded and sorted out. If you stay on top of it, shouldn't be a big deal. So you guys had to read through a chapter this week about sort of two things: the Renaissance, and also this period in the Catholic Church referred to as the Reformation. This change in religion. And so I wanted to touch on some of the highlights of this unit. And usually there's a lot of cool activities we could have done had we been in school normally. Unfortunately, we can't do it. It's a bummer, but we'll still cover the main points here. This picture, the famous painting, the School of Athens. In this picture of all the ancient Greek philosophers, but it wasn't painted in ancient Greece, as we talked about before. This was painted during the Renaissance, during this period of time coming out of the Middle Ages in Europe, where people begin to focus on learning again, focus on reclaiming that lost knowledge, putting more emphasis on learning and reading and appreciating the past. So you see a lot of obsession with ancient Greece this time period. That's why they made this famous painting. And a lot of famous artists and innovators and inventors come around this time period, and it's an interesting time because Europe's kind of recovering from the Middle Ages, where there really wasn't a lot of technological progress, right? People were sort of living in those small village manor lifestyles. They weren't, making as much change in terms of they would normally have done had they lived in cities and had, powerful leadership, right? And so this is a time period of recovery. They're sort of rediscovering, technology from the Roman Empire in some ways. Remember that people had referred to the Middle Ages as a Dark Ages. It's technically not, right? We talked way before about how it's not a Dark Age if there's writing coming from that time period. But the idea behind why people mistakenly call it that is because there really wasn't a lot of progress. So in contrast to that, the Renaissance feels like a huge amount of change is happening. That's partially because there is a huge amount of change, but also it's because everything had been stagnant and not changing for so long that any changes suddenly feel huge, right? A guy who comes about from this, this is Niccolo Machiavelli. He's one of these philosophers during the Renaissance who writes a book called The Prince. And we would have had a really cool activity where we took a quiz based off of this book. You obviously don't have to read the book, but the idea is The Prince is like an instruction manual of sorts. Niccolo Machiavelli writes how to be a good leader, a good king or prince. What are the qualities you have to have? What are the things you have to do? And if we were in school right now, we would have this little quiz where I give you scenarios and you tell me what you would do in these situations, and at the end we see how much we line up with what Machiavelli says or says you should do. And the gist of it is that in The Prince he details what does it mean to be a strong ruler, and he thought it was an important book coming out of a time period where in the Middle Ages they didn't have very strong rulers very often, right? And he says some simple things, some things that are obvious, right? You should rely on your own army, not the armies of allies. You should seek to get rid of people or enemies who are stronger than you if they're a threat to you. But he also famously comes to the conclusion that it is better to be feared than loved, which is always sort of an interesting idea. And I compare this to, think about teachers that you behave better for. Do you behave better for teachers that you like, or do you behave better for teachers that you're afraid of? And you get some interesting answers when you ask students this question. But Machiavelli's idea behind it, what he believes as to why it'd be better to be feared than loved, is he says you can't control if people like you. You can't force someone to love you. But he says you can control if people fear you. And he says that good rulers rule by things they can control. So he made the argument that it's better to have people to be afraid of you than be a ruler that people liked. He also said it was the ruler's sole responsibility to win wars, to go out and win battles, that laws don't matter, laws come secondary. Having a strong army, winning battles, conquering is more important. Interesting guy. He himself was not a king, right? He's a philosopher. He's thinking about what are qualities of good kings. And definitely an odd book, right? Not a lot of people rule through the ideas of Machiavelli today, but it was a big deal back then, and it has been a pretty interesting piece of history, right? Johann Gutenberg, or Johannes Gutenberg, depending on how you see his name, invented this thing, the printing press, not the stock photo. Important thing here, before this, every book was handwritten, right? We talked about how in monasteries, monks would like handwrite pages out of the Bible, and owning a Bible or owning books was really rare because of how expensive they were. It took so long to make. The printing press is basically a big giant stamp, right? You could create a page, put ink on it, and you could stamp and make copies of that page, and it sped up the ability to print books and pamphlets immensely. So all of a sudden you have this much wider variety of available information, things that people have access to. And that's a huge deal in terms of like literacy, people learning to read, people having access to religious texts, and it really starts to make some pretty big changes to how information is spread in Europe. And in one way, it kind of causes a rift within the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church believed at that time period that you could read a Bible on your own, although it was only in Latin. So if you could read Latin, you could get a Bible and you could read it. But they preferred that you kind of didn't, because the Catholic Church at the time period believed that the average person reading a Bible is not going to make informed decisions. They're not going to understand it as well as a priest, a Catholic priest, someone who is trained to read and sort of figure out the importance of a Bible verse or whatever they're reading, right? And so they prefer that you didn't do that. They would prefer that you went to church and had these professionals tell you what the Bible meant and read the Bible to you. And so now the printing press exists, and the Bible is more widely available. People are beginning to read it on their own, and they're not necessarily drawing the same conclusions from some of these stories that the Catholic Church priests would have drawn from it. And that's kind of an interesting thing, because all of a sudden you have these differing of opinions in a religion that before this point, kind of the only way you knew it was in the Bible is your priest told you what was in it, right? So these people can read it on their own now, and it's kind of dangerous because people are interpreting it differently. It's going to cause some conflict in the church. It doesn't help that at the same time, the Catholic Church has some pretty big problems of its own in terms of like corruption. And there were people who were in high positions of power in the Catholic Church that were not necessarily as noble with their goals. They were, there was taking of money, there was people using it for political gain, stuff like that. But the biggest thing, I think it's always really kind of fun to talk about because it's such an interesting idea, is what's referred to as the selling of indulgences. So the Catholic Church began the process of selling basically forgiveness of sins. So what they would do is, if you had thought that you'd committed, some sort of sin, and you're afraid that you weren't going to go to heaven when you died, the Catholic Church would literally sell you for a pretty large sum of money a piece of paper that a Catholic priest would write on saying that you've been absolved or forgiven for your sins. And according to them, it was perfectly acceptable, and it was something they were allowed to do, right? And remember, they're the ones who interpreted the Bible at the time. They interpreted the Bible to mean that they could do that, right? That causes all sorts of problems, because then what's the point of, like, if you're a devout Catholic, what's the point of following rules and, being nice to people and, not committing sins and stealing and, doing all this bad stuff if you could just pay for literally a get out of jail free card and make sure that your soul goes to heaven? And it made people kind of really upset, particularly poor people. People who can't afford indulgences felt, this isn't fair. That means the poor people have to live their lives piously, religiously, and follow all the rules, but these rich people can just buy their way out of sin, right? It got worse in that they let you buy indulgences for family members who had passed away. So some of these Catholic churches would sort of guilt you. If you had a relative who had died, they would say, you want to make sure your relative's soul is going to heaven, right? Because they could be burning in hell if you don't go and buy these indulgences to help, get their spirit into heaven, where it's supposed to be. And that's a lot of guilt to put on these, devoutly religious people. So you have people like scraping money together to buy these things. Like I said, it becomes this thing that really upsets poor people. And people start to question, does the church really have the right to do this? And this is where, that I've explained multiple times this year, that Christianity begins to branch out. Because at one point in time, Christianity was just the Catholic Church. So up until this point, if you were a Christian, you were Catholic, right? But now it changes because Martin Luther comes along, who was born a Catholic, right? And the selling of indulgences and this corruption in the church causes him to really reflect on what he thinks is wrong with the Catholic Church. And he comes up with a list of 95 questions. It's called the 95 Theses. And he nails them to the door of a church in his town. 95 questions asking why the church, can do the things they can do. We'll zoom into this very action-packed picture. Worth talking about really quickly. This picture is not accurate. I'm going to show you a more accurate one in a second. But sometimes we tend to paint this as like this big historical moment. I had a college professor who always made fun of the fact that they talk about how Martin Luther walks up the door of his local church and he, nails these 95 questions on the center of the door of the church. And it's supposed to be this big, epic moment that he's questioning this authority. It's really not a big epic moment. In fact, it looked closer to something like this. Because the doors of these churches in the Middle Ages, they are like bulletin boards. People just hung signs and things on them all the time. So it wouldn't just be like this big act of protest. Now it is still a controversial thing. He's questioning the church. 95 issues that he has with it. And among them are the selling of indulgences. He questions if that's allowed. He questions a lot of things the church is doing. Other things that he had issues with. They had people who were bishops representing areas they didn't live in. Like, I'm the bishop of, the western part of France, but I live in Italy, right? Am I really in charge of those people? Do I know what they're doing? Those kind of things. So anyway, he nails the list on there. Supposed to get people thinking. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, that list gets taken, and using that brand new printing press that had been invented, it gets duplicated. They make hundreds to thousands of copies of his 95 Theses, and they send out these 95 theses all over Europe, and people read it, and they think he's got a lot of good points. So much so that he gets excommunicated from the Catholic Church. They kick him out of the church. And he creates his own religion that's still around today, called Lutheranism. And that's under the Protestant Christianity religions, right? So now you have two versions of Christianity. You have Catholics and you have Protestants. And the Protestants will include Lutherans. They'll include several others that will come about. But a lot of people start to follow Luther's teachings, and he teaches, indulgences don't exist. You can't buy your way into heaven or buy your way to sin. He starts to teach people that, people should be allowed to read the Bible and interpret it on their own. It should be translated into multiple languages, and you shouldn't need to go to just a priest to have them tell you what it means. And he inspires other people to make their own religions as well. Another one your book talks about around the same time period is John Calvin, who creates Calvinism. Calvinists are another Protestant group of Christianity. Remember, they're reading the same Bible, but they're interpreting it a little differently. Calvinists believe, the interesting thing about them is they believe in predestination. So Calvinists believed that, like when you were born, it was already determined whether you're going to heaven or not. That no matter what you do, it doesn't change where you go when you die. So you'd think the first thought that you would have is, okay, if I was a Calvinist, it doesn't matter what I do. Why go to church? Why be religious, right? It kind of operates on the idea of like, everyone thinks for sure they're going to heaven, so they're going to live a devout life to prove that that's where they're going, sort of thing. It's an interesting perspective on religions. But a lot of these Protestant religions that this chapter talks about, they're still around today. There's even more today. There's a ton of them, right? And they're all lumped under Christianity because they're all still reading the same basic book, right? The last thing that the chapter talks about is the church's sort of response to how they viewed this separation, right? This religious revolution. And they had what's painted here, the Council of Trent, where the Catholic Church meets to try to address all of the problems people keep having with the Catholic Church. And by the end of this, they do resolve a lot of these issues, but it's kind of too little too late, right? People have already kind of switched religions. You don't really switch religions real easily. A lot of these people will not come back. But The Council of Trent fixes a lot of the issues in the Catholic Church, but it is a almost 20 year-long meeting. Think about that. It's a long time to meet and debate and hammer out these issues. In fact, where they built the meeting place, the Council of Trent, this a small village, becomes a fairly large, town, making money off just providing food and a place to stay for all these people, and these heated debates of what they're going to do, and the church has to figure out another way to make money, right? Because indulgences have made them a lot of money, but when they kind of have to stop selling those, that's a lot of income loss. Like I said, it's a big period of change. The theme of this chapter, obviously, you can tell, is these drastic changes, right? These changes in learning, these changes in religion. They're pretty long-lasting. There are still Catholics and there are still Protestants today, right? It's not as violent as it used to be, but there were periods of time where those two groups were willing to fight each other in the name of their version of Christianity, right? It's not the only religion that's had that issue, but it's worth mentioning that there are still parts of the world today that are mostly Protestant, and there are parts of the world that are mostly Catholic, and depending on where you're at, you kind of don't advertise which one you are, right? In the United States, we kind of have a little bit of everything. It's a little different here, but there are parts of the world where it's not as welcoming. Anyway, that wraps up the highlights to this. Like I said, please make sure you get your work in this week, and then keep an eye out Friday for the final work assignment. If you have any corrections that you have not done for tests, those also need to be done probably before Tuesday or Wednesday next week, because I got to get that all in. That's about it. What an end to a 6th grade year. We're moving on. U.S. history next year. Hopefully we'll be in a classroom. Have a good one.